back with the next sessions, and I'm going to tell you that on parallel, you have a session about lean in higher education, and we have Chris Shannon talking about creating a problem-solving culture. And here on the main stage, I would like to welcome my good friend, John Amelian, who's going to be moderating for Tracy Xie in Singapore. And they're going to be talking about unlocking economic value through decarbonization. Hello, hello. How are you?
Hello. Thank you. Thank you, Roberto. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're coming from, and very welcome to our session. I'm John Hameli, and I'm part of the Lean Global Network based in Singapore. And our speaker, as Roberto said, is also based here in Singapore. And actually, we're part of something we call the Excellence Community. So we've known each other for a long time and always share our learnings with each other. I've known Dr. Tracy Xie for, I think, Tracy, at least 10 years, right? And Tracy is amazing. She's not only a lean practitioner, she has a lot of experience inside quite a few companies, all different types of industries for many years, but she's also a sustainability practitioner. And in fact, her PhD, and I remember when you were working on your PhD, Tracy, she was combining both of those of how you can apply lean thinking and other innovation methods to actually increase performance economically and environmentally for companies. So she's going to share something with us that, you know, I've been involved with sustainability for about 15 years now. She's going to share something with us that a lot of people are not talking about. Most of what you hear is about what we have to do. Reporting, compliance, regulations, and most of the things that companies don't want to do. You know, instead, in true lean thinking fashion, Tracy's going to focus on value and the more value that we can add. So instead of looking at decarbonization as a kind of a waste thing to do, look at it as a valuable thing. What are the benefits of doing this, and how can companies leverage that? So it's not just something we have to do, but something we want to do. So Tracy, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, John, for the introduction. I hope you can hear me okay and see my screen.
Everything's good. Do you want to try your cursor?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can see your cursor. Good.
Perfect. Thank you. Good day, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here and share a proposal of lean and green. Specifically, as John mentioned, how lean thinking and methodology can help organizations achieve their decarbonization ambitions in a way that creates value, and by doing that, achieve planet, people, and profit targets. Before we dive into the content, I would like to make a disclaimer that the views expressed in the presentation today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of Shell. Let's dedicate the time to the focused topic of lean and green today, and I will not comment on any Shell-specific questions. Move on to our content. I will start by giving an overview of the climate change and the decarbonization challenges. And then we'll deep dive into the 5 areas that the lean can help deal with those challenges, from identifying value in decarbonization to mapping and reducing carbon footprints while maximizing the value for customer and the company. Besides companies' own carbon emissions, I will share how to use lean thinking to reduce supply chain emissions, which is usually the biggest part of total carbon footprints. Last but not least, we will also cover how companies can incorporate decarbonization into strategic plan and cascade through the organization to achieve sustainable results. To start with, as a global society, we're now fully acknowledge that climate change, particularly the global warming, has become a compounding issue that threatens human being survival on this planet. According to the discussion in COP29, which is still ongoing, it's a UN-organized climate change conference, which with leaders from almost 200 countries participating. According to the latest funding, 2024, the year we have been living now, is on track to be the hottest year in recorded human history. And I'm sure you will witness some extreme weathers around yourself. Different parts of the world, we heard about extreme heat. And then even in this region, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, we heard there's been about 6 hurricanes has happening in the past 4 weeks in Philippines, which is quite phenomenal in terms of the change of the climate. Well, the relationship between global warming and greenhouse gas emissions has been established almost a century before by science. In order to prevent catastrophic weather and keep the global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees above pre-industry levels, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions significantly from now to 2030. And this is what this chart is trying to highlight here. And then with significant compensation measures in the following 20 years to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees. However, if we look at the trend from implemented policies around the globe, we are actually already reached a threshold about 1.3 degrees increase from the temperature compared with pre-industry. And then we'll overshoot the target by a lot if we continue from the implemented policies around the globe. So in order to keep our commitment to Paris Agreement, it is a challenge. And there's a call for urgent and significant actions to prevent the catastrophic more than 3 degrees increase by the end of the century. Systematic, urgent, and bold actions are required to accelerate decarbonization. And the lean, as all of us practitioners here, can play a significant role in it to help companies reduce the greenhouse gas emission in a sustainable way. According to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, companies' greenhouse gas emissions are categorized into Scope 1, 2, and 3. If we take a look at the Scope 1 in the middle, it is about emissions that produced from companies' own assets and facilities. For example, greenhouse gas emissions during production and emissions from companies' own vehicles during cargo or people transportation. While Scope 2 is about emissions from the company's purchased energy source, such as electricity, steam, heating, and then cooling for companies' own use. Scope 1 and Scope 2 are quite straightforward, as you can see, and then it's within the company's control. But Scope 3, on the other hand, is much more complicated, as you can see here, as it covers 15 types of activities from both upstream and downstream. And the Scope 3 usually also takes 80 or 90% or even higher proportion of the total emissions. And that is much more difficult to reduce compared with Scope 1, 2, because of the complexity of align the targets, align the costs and the benefits, and then just engage and bring a big group of stakeholders on board to address the problem. Well, the good news is, in response to the urgency and the magnitude of efforts taken to address the climate issues, many countries have announced a mandatory climate report obligation for listed and the non-listed companies. This is to urge the companies provide transparency of the carbon footprint of their business, and more importantly, taking efforts to reduce emissions in line with Paris Agreement. Here in Singapore, the regulations has been published that all the public listed companies in Singapore are required to report their Scope 1, 2 emissions from fiscal year 2025, that is just around the corner. And the Scope 3 specific supply chain emissions will be included in the reporting scope from 2026. Similar obligations will also be mandated to the big to medium-sized non-listed companies in the following years till 2030. Besides Singapore, there are 13 other jurisdictions in Asia-Pacific region here have also have a similar climate reporting obligations. Decarbonization is no longer an option, as you can see, but a mandate for the company to comply and fulfill the obligation. Well, with this good news, we also have heard from the companies, from the industry, the challenges they are facing. While we have, I think there was a survey conducted recently across the top 100 companies has announced their net zero or decarbonization targets. There's only very limited, if I recall, less than 5% company has been lived up to the commitment so far. And one of the challenges they're facing is the lack of the business case. As we know, the primary focus for the ambition, the target for the company is to create sustainable value for the owner and then for the shareholders, for the stakeholders. Just now in the COP28, we have shared the challenge that in order to reach our decarbonization ambition, as a global, we need incremental 1 trillion investments to help fund and then accelerate decarbonization initiative, versus now the funding is just about 100 billions at the moment. The challenge come here, as you see on the ground, first is like the lack of the business case from investor perspective. The example I bring here is if you look at the IEA ambition to triple our renewable energy supply by 2030. However, we are facing the quite increased cost from the renewable winds, which then has been pushing down the growth of the renewable wind energy by 30 to 40% in some of the markets. If we look from the company perspective, sustainable aviation fuel has also been identified as a viable solution to address the emissions during the aviation segment, which is hard to rebut in sector. However, there's also a lack of the economic case for the aviation, for the airlines, and then for the individual travelers like us to take up the incremental cost and then accelerate the transition. And then if you look at the individual consumer perspective, similarly in aviation, the road transportation has also been a sector bear the very heavy emission. And electric vehicles plays a critical role for the transition from ICE internal combustion engine to a greener transportation method. However, the total cost of owning the EV car is still hanging there for many of the private car owners or the fleets when they consider converting from traditional fuels vehicle to the EV. So how can we address this value and the economic case challenge? But first, let's look at what does the value mean from the whole ecosystem, right? And here, if we use the lean concept, lean thinking, let's start define the value from the 3 stakeholders perspective. And I must say across the whole ecosystem, different stakeholders, they do have different understanding and expectation of the value created or generated with the decarbonization. First, if we look from the customer perspective, consumers like you and I, normally we are looking at, okay, what is the total saving from the total cost of ownership with uncompromised function? If I'm looking at, for example, converting to the internal combustion engine to the EV car, other than the non-compromised function, which is get me to point A to point B safely, how does that impact the total cost by owning the EV, including EV charging, maintenance, insurance, everything in total take consideration? The second, consumers and customers would also look at what is the value for money if I have to spend the same money, am I getting more function? Does it address the different requirement of my needs with, let's say, green or lower carbon emission products? And then usually the customer will also look at how does this choose of this greener or the sustainable, more sustainable product align with my personal value and then belief, as it's also kind of my green or sustainable lifestyle preference, which has become the trend for the younger generations. Second, if we look from the company perspective, just now, earlier session, when John and Brian present about the lean training, I heard a very encouraging cases about the green treasure hunt, right? It's very encouraging to hear what GE and Toyota has conducted and identified 200K potential savings just from energy efficiency, energy saving. While other than the cost saving from the energy efficiency and waste reduction, which the typical lean method can help a lot. There's also the huge untapped value. Look at how can we generate incremental sales from the green premiums that customers willing to pay, whether it's B2B or B2C customer. Or if these green products can help the company tap on the new markets or the new customer segment, which hasn't been tapped before. There could also be increased sales with enhance the brand or the reputation or the image by the company communicating the substantial efforts that have been taking to fight the decarbonization challenge. And then last, let's also not forget, with the regulation rollouts, either being the compliance or the fine of the greenhouse gas carbon reporting compliance, or either from the carbon taxes, which has implemented quite a lot of jurisdiction. This also brings the lower capital cost if the company leverage the green finance, or it can also help the company avoid the compliance cost by taking the substantial decarbonization initiatives. So there's a bunch of more than the company can tap on when they identify where to focus in their decarbonization initiative and how much value it can generate to justify the cost and then investment it may accomplish with such initiative. Last but not least, from the investor perspective, usually they are looking at both long-term and short-term return of investments, which is the mission of the capital. And then a lot of the investment institutions also taking the ESG and then climate change in their risk management. And then there's also a few impact investment sector also look at specific environmental or reduce emissions impact as a result of this investment. So you can see by looking at the customer, company, and investor, there is a holistic value associated with the company's decarbonization initiative. So the question is, at the company level that we are working at, how to identify and where should I prioritize, put our limited human and capital resource to generate the biggest return. Here is a proposal of the different steps, start from taking from the single product or service design perspective. For those that are familiar, you may recall this aligned with the lean product design, the circle, right? So usually we'll start with focus on the early adopters with the notable size of the demands for such lower carbon or the sustainable product or services. Taking EV as an example, EV as a no carbon product compares with ICE, we need to figure out where are the markets the EV adopters may have, whether it's based on the supply of the available type of cars or whether it's based on the government regulation. And then once we have identified the specific market segments, it is also a good way to convert the general VOC by saying, hey, I would prefer the green product to specific quality to critical to quality feature when we design and map the priorities. And also with quantify the value from what we heard from customer. From there, we then take the CDQ to the quality function deployments, which then take the further down to say, hey, what exactly does that mean for my supply chain for the functions am I going to put in this product? And then how much cost associated with it? And then how does that impact on the carbon footprint during the production of this product? And also remember, we talk about scope 3, the upstream and the downstream emissions of this product. So in EV example, this could come from how should I consider the sourcing of the battery? How should we consider the second life or the end life recycle of the battery? And then what's the implication from both cost, value, and the carbon footprint perspective? Lastly, but also very important, let's test this function with end customers to see how do they feel, does it really address the critical, the VOC, the critical to quality features they have in mind, and then how much they're willing to pay. So the affordability is usually also a critical part to test at the beginning. At the bottom, you will see the green box. Given this is very dynamic space with the change of the regulations and the whole ecosystem landscape, once we have finished the product design circle, it's always good to identify what are the policy and external environment signposts, and then go back validate these assumptions from time to time. One of the pitfalls, I think as John also mentioned in the earlier green and lean session, is to avoid over-processing of the green features. Always validate how much is customer willing to pay for the decarbonization quality, and how does it look like from multi-year investment and return perspective. So that's first step. Second one, talking about using lean to map the carbon footprints through the value stream and use the lean as a tool to identify waste and reduce the carbon footprints. We just heard about a live example from the previous session, so I'm going to very quickly touch on that. This is an example shared by the published paper. SME in UK has achieved by mapping, as you can see, the total in-house value chain. What is the total carbon footprint of each step? And then what is the value added carbon footprint? And by applying lean tools to remove the waste, as you can see, they can reduce significantly, not just the total carbon footprint in their production, but also the value added. In case you haven't missed that, the value added carbon footprint ratio has also been increased quite significantly because of these two. So I would say this is the low-hanging fruits, would encourage many of us in this call to bring back to our organization, pick the prominent product service line you have, start mapping that. That is definitely one of the lower hanging fruits to bring you encouraging results. So other than addressing the scope 1 and 2, as I mentioned earlier, scope 3 is also usually the portion that can take up to 90% of the total emission in most sectors, as you can see here. And that is also the most difficult part to tackle. If we break down the scope 3 emission across all the 15 activities, as you can see, the longest bar here, which is about the use of end products, hopefully that can be tackled by the product design at the beginning. While the second, the biggest, as you can see, is the emission from the purchased goods and services. And this is usually coming from the supply chain, which in many cases can take to up to 70% of the company's carbon greenhouse gas emission. While supply chain management and engagement is not a foreign concept in lean, right? Start from the machine changed the world. And then we just heard earlier the story, I think that Sharon from China talk about Toyota, how they engage with tier 1, 2, 3 suppliers. So it's not a foreign concept for us, but how to embed that in the decarbonization initiative, we need to be more intentional. Start from cascade the company's decarbonization target through supply chain procurement. According to the latest Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which just passed by the EU Commission in July this year, it will enable take effective at the national level from 2027. The big companies in Europe and then their suppliers across the supply chain will have to take the double materiality, the carbon footprint into consideration. So one of a recommended action the company can take is to cascade. If let's say I want to reduce my carbon footprint 10% year on year, how does that cascade to my supply chain? In my procurement contract, can I add this provision and then to operationalize at the working level? Once we have cascade and aligned the target, the next step is using the lean method to identify the win-win areas where we can address the carbon emissions by first avoid and then reduce, transform, and then if the last result after have taken the first 3 into consideration, how can we compensate if needed, use the carbon credit to address the emission. And then align that with the time-based, time-bonded, science-based targets with the suppliers, then follow through the action with reward, which is also critical, as we know, to reinforce and sustain the behavior. And then last but not least, ongoing basis, we need to have the joint capability development and then motivate, incentivize the innovation through the journey. Last but not least, if you think about the lean philosophy at the corporate strategy plan level, this is also the way, keep in mind, how can I incorporate, embed the greenhouse gas emission in my whole chain planning? Start from organization level, and then cascading to business units, cascading to the annual cycle of the product or service line, and then operationalize to the front line, running through the PDCA, and last, very important, how can I measure the result and communicating to my shareholders and then stakeholders. This is just also the example from our very familiar Toyota cases, how Toyota take their environment challenge 2050 breakdown to the product end-to-end product, the whole life cycle, and identify the green activities that we can do to address the decarbonization. So just to summarize, Lean can be a very powerful tool to help the organizations not just simply address the decarbonization, but identify the value from the point of customer, from the point of the company, and then investors to make the result sustainable. Other than identifying the carbon value from the product design, we can use the Lean tools to map out the carbon footprint in the specific selected BU or product line as a starting point, and then gradually expand it to an extended supply chain, a value chain with your suppliers through aligned targets with a science-based time-bounded action and then disciplined follow through. This is how you can validate the impact on carbon footprint and the value to make it sustainable. So decarbonization is a key enabler to deliver value to customers, not just the trade-off with the value, not just a ticket box for the compliance purpose. Last but not least, I would like to thank John and then the Sustainability Excellence community from the Lean organization to being such an advocate of Lean and Green. With the joint efforts from this community, we can find win-win solutions for environment and the economy. We can prevent the catastrophic scenarios for these and the future generations to come. That's all of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and we're open for Q&A.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you so much for sharing this. Yes, let's see if we do have any questions out there. Let's see, while I'm monitoring this, so while we do that, one question that might come up, Tracy, is you've worked in a lot of companies. How can maybe the normal practitioner contribute? Like, for example, how could they approach the sustainability? Where does the sustainability team or ESG team usually reside? How might they approach and get involved with all of this?
Thanks for the question, John. Actually, very relevant. And I think I would say during my PhD research, I has interviewed a lot of the Fortune 500 companies, and they have different setting. One thing I feel quite common is critical for the success, similar as the Lean culture, right? They all mentioned about the top-down commitment from the leadership team. They say, hey, sustainability, environmental impact for us is not option. It is embedded in the DNA of the organization. That's one statement I heard again. So with that top-down alignment, this then depends on each organization setting and what stage they are. At the beginning, they may have like chief sustainability officer or the part in one of them, transformation officer, to work out the company level strategy, kind of like what we shared earlier during the decarbonization whole-stream planning, right? But then the cascading through the organization will have to go through, rely on each of the team member across the organization to operationalize. It's easy to put a slogan, hey, I'm going to achieve net zero emission by 2050. But then what does it mean for different service, different product line, and then how does it relates to daily working in the product design and operating is a challenge.
Excellent. Yeah, Roberto's got the clock up for us. We do have, maybe if you have 30 seconds, to Madhu's question about the Lean tools, maybe quick about Lean culture. How does that play in the people and everything?
I would say that, as I mentioned, it's important to embed the value as part of the Lean thinking and then consider decarbonization is not just to check the box or the obligation, but really using the lean lens to see how does that bring on the value from the customer perspective. I think that's the first step. From there, then you can build the momentum, create the first, the low-hanging fruits, the winning momentum, and then enlarge.
Guys,
Okay.
sorry to interrupt. Sorry.
Sure, Roberto,
Thank you so
we're
much,
handing it
Tracy.
back to
Thank you so much, John.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.